Hi everyone, welcome to the second day of the QUESCREN Education and Vitality Forum 2023. So I'm just going to say a few things before I pass you over to I'm Anna Hunt, I work at QUESCREN, organizer of the forum. Thanks so much for coming. I hope the subtitles are working. So here we are. Let's give it a go. So Assistant Deputy Minister Flock, Commissioner's Representative Taker, Commissaire la langue française Benoît Dubreuil, Directors General of CEGEPs and school boards, welcome to our forum again, and also welcome to our many colleagues from the Canadian and Quebec government offices, including Ministries of Education, Ministries of Finance, and many representatives from all our community group partners and the many levels of the education sector. Thank you for making it for the second day of the forum. And now I'm going to introduce you to Mr. John Davids, research coordinator at the Black Community Resource Center, who will be introducing our keynote for today, Dr. Tia Collins, assistant professor, Faculty of Education, University of Ottawa, who will be our keynote for today. Good luck, John. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. It's so wonderful to start the morning with some laughing. So thank you, Anna, for that. And thank you to the whole QUESCREN team for organizing this very important event, as well as to Concordia University for hosting this. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces here and some new ones as well. Okay, so before introducing the next presenter, someone who I really look up to, greatly respect, and someone who even helped shape my own research journey, I want to say a few things about research and life. We often hear about the importance of research and take it as a given, perhaps romantically, that research will be carried out and will contribute in one way or another to positive change in this world, or change nonetheless. And for me, it's a bit of a gross simplification. Just because research is taking place, it doesn't mean anybody is going to benefit from it, even if the research itself is conducted with the highest standards and rigor. Research is a big word, and for some it can mean almost anything. I know people who have presented themselves to me as researchers as a way of saying that they're interrogative or observative and or curious about the world we live in. And that's perfectly fine. And others may have a more narrow idea of what constitutes credible research, and they have their right to their opinion as well. But if research carries with it a fundamental goal of progressing towards truth, we have to be honest with our limitations, our lack of knowledge, and be able to differentiate between knowledge and belief, something increasingly rare that I see these days. The question of what is driving research must also be asked. Is it financial interest? Is it self-interest or the interest of a government, organization, or corporation? How will this research be used? To be honest, in my observation of the research landscape, there isn't too much that stands up as research that can aid in bringing about positive social change or change that can better people's lives. When I see that, that stands out to me. That deserves more than some respect, which it rarely receives. The world, for me, unfortunately, has gone quite mad for some time now, and things don't look like they'll be getting better anytime soon, unless, of course, there is an intervention. And people like this next person are people I see as interveners. Let us remember that studying the human being and furthering an understanding about our species is one of the hardest and yet laudable things anyone in the research world can do. Instead of using research to try to predict the direction of a stock's price, or using it to track eye movements in order to maximize advertisement revenue, or using it to learn how to create better weapons to end human life, some use it to help their communities and communities beyond them. And these folks are a little bit different from me. They stand out. As a member of the English-speaking Black community in Quebec, regardless of all the obstacles on our path, or all the hatred, or the normalization of beliefs that are flat out lies, or beliefs that we are foreign or lesser in any way, or the open contempt in some discourse for our community and communities like ours, or even the blank-faced denial of the fact that we are a distinct community and should hold the same rights as everyone else in the community. Despite all of those things, there are still some of us trying to fight to help our communities, even if a lot of the time it feels like those fights are happening alone. Tia Collins is one of those people fighting the good fight, an increasingly rare and valuable person in this society more widely. Much of her research and education ultimately aims to correct what has been a long-lasting exclusion and injustice faced by certain members or certain groups in Quebec. And it is for that reason that it's an honor for me to introduce her this morning. She helped me greatly in trying to understand the state of education here and why some of the unjust and why some of the unjust and intense disparities are present and normalized here in our environment. And she's trying to do something about it. So please welcome Dr. Tia Collins.
Thank you, John. I'm gonna start the presentation by crying, but my name's Tia Collins. I'm from the University of Ottawa, and I just want to start immediately by making a disclaimer. I work in Ottawa, but I'm a Montrealer. I love Montreal. It's my I feel like it's it's my favorite city. It's the best city in the country. I grew up here. I was born here. I went through the school system here. And so even though I am working in Ottawa, I'm a Montrealer. So again, thank you so much, John, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Anna, who has been just kind of accompanying me up until this very day. Really, really appreciate it. This is like a full circle moment for me because I have come to QUESCREN, and I hope I'm not messing that up. I just put my own phonetics on acronyms. Do people say QUESCREN? Okay. So I've had the opportunity to come to QUESCREN as a student to present various aspects of my research over the years. And it was just always a very welcoming space for me because when you're doing research on things like race and racism and Blackness, often when you go into spaces, people are looking at you like you're an alien, and you're just kind of getting blank stares. And I've always felt very connected when I've actually presented my research here. So it's really, really an honor to be back here and to really give the full scope of what I've achieved since. I also really, really want to underscore that point because since the tragic murder of George Floyd in 2020, we're seeing that in 2020, there was like a really big interest and a really big investment. We saw mobilization, we saw marches, protests, apologies, a lot of things happening when it comes to Black lives. And now we're seeing that the momentum is really dying down. It's not really in style anymore. No one's really interested. So again, I really want to extend my thanks to QUESCREN because we're still here and we're still dealing with a lot of issues. So thank you so much. So I'm just going to start with an Indigenous affirmation. I hope you will join me in paying respect to the Kanakyaagam people, I always mess that up, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Personally, as a descendant of victims who were human trafficked from Africa, who were violently displaced to this land, I declare my deep, deep respectful solidarity while paying tribute to my African ancestors. Okay, so just to give an outline, I'm going to be starting off with going over who are the Black communities in Quebec, and then I'll move into a general overview of the Black student educational portrait. And then I'm going to be giving a specific example based on my research of Anglophone Black youth in special education. And then we're going to talk about some key considerations and recommendations. Oh, I'm off by one all the time. Okay. Good to know. Okay, so in numbers, we have the Black population, who's at about 1.2 million people in the country, representing about 3%, 3.5% of the entire Canadian population. And in Quebec, it's about the second largest Black community in the country. Because we are still struggling with collecting race-based data in the province, what we do know is that in the whole province, there's about 5% of people who are Black, and among that 5%, about 20% are English speaking. So if you're Black in Quebec, then you're definitely going to be confronted about the question, tu viens d'où? Where are you from? Okay, so doesn't matter if you have been here for, and we talk a lot about immigrants, first generation, second generation, third. Myself, I am not an immigrant. My family has been in the country for 6 generations, and I'm still getting this question, tu viens d'où? So it's just bringing up the question of, how do we see Black communities, and how long do you have to be here before you stop getting asked that question? So I wanted to raise that point, and I also wanted to raise the fact that the community is so diverse. So yes, there are people like me who have been here for so long, and then there are people who have just arrived. So while I'm very proud to be here as a representative of the Black community, there's no possible way that I can represent every member of the Black community because of all the diversity. So just always keeping in mind that we are not a monolith. It's so diverse. And that being said, we find ourselves kind of the minority within the minority within the minority. And with that comes its own challenges. So when groups are minoritized, we know that they tend to experience challenges, whether it's related to health, whether it's related to employment, and in the context of this presentation today, education. So what do we know about Black youth in Quebec schools? The portrait is extremely bleak. Almost every challenge can be noted when it comes to Black students in Quebec schools. So there are challenges related to academic performance, high school graduation. We know that there's an underrepresentation in enriched programs in public schools, as well as an underrepresentation in private schools. Then we have an overrepresentation in the adult education sector, as well as special education. And we have definitely underrepresentation in post-secondary education. I just heard a presentation from John the other day that highlighted that Black students in graduate studies represent about less than 1%, which was really sad to me. So how do we explain this portrait? Why is it so bad? So up until now, we've been really looking at education from a culturalist perspective. So we're using, again, this kind of immigration concept and this concept of acculturation. So the explanations that have been put forth as to why this portrait is so bleak is because, for example, maybe there are language learning issues, there are cultural challenges, parents maybe don't understand the system, maybe they're not involved, it's poverty. You know, there's been many different analyses in that regard, and it's a really big focus on socio-demographic factors. And I found that everything was kind of brushed over, but when it came to race and more specifically Blackness, because if we look at race as a whole, we can understand that not everybody who is racialized is going to be experiencing the same problems. So when it specifically comes to Blackness, there's kind of just like, we know that there's a bit of this denial that racism is a systemic issue and that it actually exists. And so it tends to be kind of excluded from the analysis. So I wanted to adopt a critical perspective to really see what is the system's role in this very bleak portrait. So when we're looking at things from a culturalist perspective, we are seeing the problem in the individual. So the student's bad at math, or the parents aren't available. And it's very easy to kind of put the entire weight of educational success on the individuals and their families. And when we shift to a critical perspective, then we start to see how there are outside factors that are actually affecting how the students are performing as well. So these are some things that I would like to share with you today. Okay, so Anglophone Black youth in special education. So if we take a closer look at this issue of overrepresentation in special education, we see that it happens in both the French and the English sectors. So we have, when we're talking about special education, we have students who are designated with special needs and who are educated in regular classroom settings. And then we have other environments that they can be transferred to, either special classes or special schools. So in the French sector, it's a very, very flagrant overrepresentation, where Black students are representing almost 40% of the special needs population. And that's enormous. In the English sector, it's not as flagrant, but when we look at special schools, and I'm just using special schools for uniformity, depending on what school board you're dealing with, where the schools are going to be called alternative schools, outreach schools. There are different names across different boards, but so just for uniformity, I'm going to be saying special schools and special classes. And we see that in the English sector, the overrepresentation in the special schools is quite more significant. So how do we explain this? I wanted to understand this overrepresentation and how students actually get placed in these special schools. How do they get there? So I went into, I'm drawing data today from schools. I went into English school boards across Montreal as well as suburbs. And I went into the youth sector. I conducted interviews with students and staff members, both in regular schools, because that's where the actual process starts, and in special schools as well. So I'm drawing on interviews with 20 students who self-identified as Black and who were enrolled in a special school at the time. And I interviewed various actors, so principals, teachers, guidance counselors, behavioral technicians, and special education placement committee members. Just to give an overview of that process, a very condensed overview. So the process starts always, or typically, with a referral in the regular school. So a teacher will make an observation based on a behavior that they find concerning or some academic difficulties. They'll make a referral. The referral goes to the special education committee. The committee facilitates a transition, and then the student is transferred to a special school. Okay, so the referrals from special schools. Now, here, what I really wanted to do is present to you a contrast between what the students were experiencing and what the educators were experiencing. And you'll see that the stories are very, very different. So in terms of referrals, what they did both agree on is that there were issues with academics and there were issues with behavior. Now, here, when we are talking, so the schools are basically saying that, you know, we are encountering situations that are too difficult for us to address in a regular school setting. So we find that these students need extra support. So we are going to make these referrals so that the students can get the help that they need. And we have an administrator here is saying that they want the students to have some kind of experience of success and not always being in a failing position. So it's all about the well-being of the student, making sure that they get the supports that they need. And this is after exhausting numerous resources. So for the students who also tend to acknowledge that they are in fact having some difficulties, but for them, they are just really not getting the support and the help that they need in the regular schools. So they're reaching out and they're being met with some hostile responses. So they're feeling intimidated when they are asking for help. They're expected to know everything. If they ask for help, it's kind of, they're made to feel stupid. We have Raquel here saying that, you know, the teacher just thought, oh, you should know that. And so she would just shut down and she wouldn't ask for help at all. I wasn't getting the help that I needed. And there were other examples related to just social aspects. Students just indicated that the teachers were not approachable. They were experiencing a lot of intimidation, especially racial intimidation. When these things were communicated to staff, there was just a total unresponsiveness. Girls were going through a lot, gender-based intimidation. We had multiple stories where girls had their photos distributed across the school, naked photos of them from a boy or something. And when these issues were reported, the solution was referring them out to a special school because they were having social difficulties. So it was just kind of not being addressed and shifted somewhere else. Now, so we have this whole discourse of student well-being from the staff, but from the student perspective, it's really about socio-academic neglect. Now, the transition from a regular school to a special school, we have a similar type of story. So for the educators, this is really an inclusive, caring practice because the students are not having a good time in a regular school. So we are going to help, and we're going to make sure that there are things in place to facilitate the transition. Some kind of evaluations or consultations. And it's a process where the family is involved. If they don't agree with the decisions that are being made, they can perhaps meet with what this placement committee member says. They can resort to the regional office, for example, if they are not in agreement. So it's a very inclusive practice in terms of the transition. And when we speak to the students, we get, again, an opposite kind of story. So it was actually quite shocking because the students themselves did not even know that they had gone through a placement process. So for the students, they were just getting kicked out. So I got kicked out because I did something related to my behavior, or I got kicked out because I was failing. And when it came to the transition, we hear Dwayne here saying, they didn't ask me any questions or anything. They just told me I was suspended and I didn't go to school for the next 2 weeks, maybe 3. I knew I had no other choice. There's nothing I could really do. And so there were many stories of students, again, so during this transition period, they're staying home for many, many weeks. They don't know what's gonna happen to them. So they're missing school. They're not in a regular school or a special school. They're kind of just at home. And the parents themselves are very much unaware as well. And they're kind of just waiting for their fate to be dictated. So from the institutional view, we have this caring and regulated process. From the student point of view, we're getting kicked out, we're waiting in limbo, and we're entirely excluded from the decision-making process. Now we're at our placement in special schools. So the interesting thing here was that the special school staff recognized that students were going through a really hard time and they wanted to be there to help the students. So they wanted to catch them and offer them support when they got there. So Clarice, an administrator, is saying, our schools work very hard to make going to school and being in school a positive experience, a place where students can feel safe. We nurture them, we tend to their needs. It's all about building relationships with these kids. And in this case, students actually agreed. So when they left the regular school, when they finally got to the special school, and they did mention before getting there, they were terrified because they heard such terrible things about the schools. The schools were for criminals, the schools were for delinquents, drug users, drug dealers. It was just a really bad image. But when they got to the school, they found a pleasant surprise and they started to experience really positive situations. So the same student here, Raquel, who was struggling with math that I presented earlier, she's saying, I really liked it there. I started understanding math and it was like, wow. I was really happy that I changed schools because she actually experienced some success. So it's the same person, it's the same difficulty, but in this special school setting, she's now experiencing success. And overall, the students were just giving very positive feedback. So they were saying things like, the school feels like a community, it feels like family, I love my teachers. So there were really relationships being built, relationships of trust, relationships of care. So I'll also go over Karen's testimony. You said, I just got more confidence in myself. It was way easier for me to learn. I feel more comfortable. It boosted my self-esteem. I got a lot of praise and a lot of love. And so we can just see what can make the difference here. And so what is interesting about one of the ways that the special schools are able to foster these relationships is through their disciplinary approaches, which are non-punitive. So there were other factors such as low student-teacher ratios, just generally a smaller physical environment, so it's making it more intimate, and it was easier for teachers to kind of build relationships with their students, and the non-punitive aspect of discipline was very significant. We have Hugh here saying that we don't want anyone to feel as though we gave up on them, so we hang on to them. Dealing with emotions, you can't punish or discipline something when something's in pain and feeling bad. So I wish that, the story ends here and that everyone lives happily ever after. But unfortunately, when it came to disciplinary measures, the story kind of breaks down again. So for the students, just to sum it up, it's extremely punitive. So I've given examples of different degrees. So starting with Marcus, who was, having problems coming into school on time. So he was placed on a contract so that he would get there on time. The contract was obviously ineffective. He was still late. And because of chronic late, he was expelled from the special school. So we know the special schools as well as kind of like a last stop in the educational trajectory. So if they're being expelled from a special school, where are we going to send them after that? We have another example with Amina, who says that she has problems with her temper, which is why, that's not my phone, by the way. She has problems with her temper, and she was placed in a special school for that reason. And so she said that there was an incident where she believed that a staff member referred to her as a beggar. She lost her temper and she told the staff member off. And then she wanted to attempt a restorative act. So she wanted to fix that. And she's explaining here, it hurts me that I actually did the right thing for the first time and they expelled me. I actually asked to have a meeting and I'm trying so hard not to cry, but it's coming out. I'm trying to be strong and they're just there staring at me. I'm telling them my pain and the principal just looks at me and he's like, I appreciate it, Amina, but you're not coming back to this school. So they expelled me because I was on a contract and they gave me way too many chances, which clearly they didn't give me any chance at all. I decided to highlight these examples, but there were many, many more that were much more concerning, and I presented them elsewhere, and I found them very, just very depleting energetically, but they're very concerning. So we have examples of students who are being physically restrained, who are being, thrown to the ground. The police is being called into elementary schools to subdue children. Children are being tranquilized. Like there is a very wide array of punitive discipline, of exclusionary discipline, and of violent discipline. So I'm just wanting to think about this contrast in perspectives. How do we explain, why do the personnel think everything is going amazing and the students are just experiencing really something that is completely opposite? So we could maybe look at this as like, okay, hey, everybody just has a different experience, that's just how it is. But for me, I wanted to come back to our critical lens when we're looking at the special education placement process here. So this is just a reminder. So from a really critical perspective, when we're looking at the special education placement process, we have this discourse of psychologization. So happy I pronounced that properly for once. Okay, and so it's basically, this discourse of student well-being. We're doing everything for the student to be okay. And then we have this discourse of inclusion where the family is involved, they have access to the information that they need, and the discourse of non-punishment. We don't punish here because, again, the students need to feel like they belong, like they feel safe. And wow, I'm sorry that this is not formatted to the slide. So going to try to explain this, but okay. So I really wish I could fix this. Okay. Through this discourse of psychologization, what we see with the naked eye, and I wanted to bring attention since the only thing we can see is that magnifying glass. So what we see with the naked eye is that the student is failing and the school is helping. They don't want the student to have this experience of failure, so the school is helping. Through the discourse of inclusion, the family is not involved, okay? It's like they can come, but they don't come. So the family's not involved, but the special education committee is going to facilitate this transition. And this discourse of non-punishment is like, there is a threat, there's an imminent threat in the school, we're gonna handle it because, so the regular schools don't have to, we're gonna handle this threat and we're gonna make sure that the larger school community is protected. But what we're not seeing is all of the effects on the students when they're going through the process. So we're not seeing these, the way they are being disempowered. We're not seeing the anxiety. We're not seeing the trauma that it's invoking. We're not seeing how unstable, how destabilizing it is, how scared they are to leave the regular school, how they don't feel good about themselves for not being able to behave and for not being able to perform. We're not seeing any of the negative impact that it has on the student. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight prior to getting to that is that the student voices are constantly excluded. They're constantly being shut down. And I want to go to my I want to go back, but I'm afraid to ruin the flow of the presentation. Let's see here. Okay, because this slide really sucks, but I wanted to go back to this magnifying glass, and I wanted to really note, if you noticed that the students in the graphics don't have any faces. They don't have eyes, they don't have mouths, so they're really invisibilized. And I did that intentionally because I feel like this represents really well how the experience is in schools. So the perspectives of the educators are there. We see their emotions. We often see their emotions, and the students kind of just blank. And this is what I mean. So I also chose to do this because this is what a critical perspective allows us to look underneath the surface and to see how invisible the students really are throughout the whole process. So what I really want to drive home today is that the students' voices matter, the family voices matter, and that we need to really stop making decisions without them. And even though we're saying that they're included and that they have rights and that, they signed off on the IEP or whatever the case may be, it's not happening. So they're kind of just being shifted through the system in a really traumatic way. So when when other researchers, Black researchers in particular, are saying that schools are really unwelcoming, violent places for Black students, we're basing it on the feelings that the students are having. And so we want to change that. And then when we come up to our recommendations, because in education, we always have to make recommendations. And can you tell that I'm excited about this part? So when I was thinking about recommendations today, I thought about an experience that I had. I went to Nova Scotia last year for a conference, and I learned about something that was called the Black Report. And it was a very similar report to what I just did, except it was from 1994. And it was a 493-page document documenting all the obstacles, all the challenges, all the violences that Black students were experiencing in schools, with numerous recommendations. And while I was at that conference, someone raised the question, like, we did this and it's 30 years later and nothing's changed. So, John, I'm really happy that you talked about the aspect of transformative research earlier today, because we're not seeing these transformations through the research that we're conducting. And so the recommendation that I want to make today is to love Black students. And thank you. And it's really that simple. Like, it's that simple. And we, yes, and the students say it. And I think I gave an example, but we really saw in the special schools, when they felt loved, when they felt belonging, it was so meaningful to them. And so, it was really, really unfortunate that that those ties are severed when the discipline comes in. And there's a lot of literature about disparities in discipline, about Black youth, and restorative programs. Again, the recommendations are there, the action plans are there, everything already exists. And I think that our energy needs to be invested in love. And that's how I think I should end it. Thank you so much.
It's fine, but let's give it up one more time for Tia Collins. Wow, what did I say before? What did I tell you? So we're gonna read out a couple of questions, Tia. And I even have one or two myself, but I'll start with what's on the screen. The first question from Anonymous is your research from only the English sector schools or both English and French?
Okay, so what I presented today is specifically from the English sector. My literature review concerns both sectors, and I focused on English because there tends to be not a lot of data about what's happening in English schools. So it was from English schools. I'm seeing that people are starting to more incorporate the English system in general research across the province, which is promising, but the study that I presented today was from the English sector.
Okay, thank you. For the next question, again from Anonymous, does your research do any comparative studies between Black youth in English and French educational systems in Quebec?
So this is one of the first studies that I conducted, and so it would definitely be interesting to do that. I haven't done it, but because I would say about 5 of the participants in the study, they actually went through the French sector first. And so they talked about their experiences in the French sector. And in the French sector, it sounded like it was going really, really, really bad. So a lot of those aspects that I talked about in terms of violence with the police coming in schools for students, and that was happening a lot in the French sector. So I think it's definitely worth it to really go in and do a comparative study, or at least a contrasting study, so that we have a good aperçu of both systems.
Next question, can you please define again special schools?
Yes, and okay, so I'm using the term special schools because I'm using terminology that's in official documentation. And that itself, I also found very challenging because we have special education policies that are written in French and then are translated to English, and that are not good translations. And so some things that have a certain connotation in French mean something completely different in English. Notably how even the acronym élèves handicapés en difficulté d'apprentissage et d'adaptation, when we translate that to English, it's a horrible translation. So again, the special schools it rings weird, but also I wanted to use that special school. It's basically an alternative school. Sometimes we're calling it outreach schools, and they're basically just smaller schools specifically existing for students who are designated with special needs.
Okay. Has the ministry ever acknowledged the particular situation of Black English-speaking youth as a minority within a minority within a minority?
Yeah, the answer to that is no, because the ministry will not even really acknowledge race, so much less acknowledging Black anything. So we are still very ingrained in a culturalist approach. We're talking about integration, we're talking about immigration, we're talking about acculturation and different things related to ethnicity, but there is very, very, very little discussion about race.
Is your research and findings from Montreal area schools, including the extreme cases of violence, or is this province-wide?
So it's Montreal on and off island. So I have not named the school boards because we're in the minority, just for confidentiality purposes, it would be much too obvious, but it's on island and off island. And did the question go away? I didn't see. Yeah, I don't know if that aspect of violence is shocking, but it was the theme was definitely recurring. So, and students were being very graphic about it. Again, I chose not to give explicit details today, but it was very, very concerning. And yes, I'm confirming that it's Montreal on and off island.
So the icons you showed, your icons represent the teachers in the special schools as white. Is there any measurable trend to diversify the teaching staff?
Is there any measurable trend to diversify the teaching staff? I'm not sure if I understand that question, but I did choose the icons white because that was the representation in my research. Most of the people that I interviewed were white, not everybody, but it was the majority. Now, if there's a trend to diversify the teaching staff, I mean, we definitely need, we know that representation matters, so we definitely need to see more Black teachers, principals in general. If that's being addressed, I haven't seen the evidence yet.
Are there best practices that we should know about to humanize the process?
Yeah, so that's kind of coming back to my heart. I think I should have left that slide up because I think, and I want to thank one of my mentors for this because again, with our constant inclination to want to do something and want to take action, we lose sight of what we're actually doing as educators. So we're very much interested in best practices, but for what I learned, it's not about practice, it's about being. So being love, being a good person, like leaving your stress outside of the classroom and really showing up and being present for the students. So, and when we're talking about this aspect of humanization, it goes so way, way beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today, because we're really going to start talking about the dehumanization that has taken place historically. And that's another thing that I think is important. We really have to stop doing ahistorical analyses, because then we start to see that dehumanizing practices that existed and we like to leave in the past and think it was like 100 years ago, there are still remnants of those things happening now. So I think it's important for us to really acknowledge, you know, the history of dehumanization when it comes to Black and Indigenous people, and to understand that it didn't just evaporate, it's still ingrained in the system, and it constitutes a systemic problem.
Are the differences in the proportions of male and female Black students who end up in special schools? I guess it's supposed to be, are there differences in the proportions of male and female Black students who end up in special schools?
Okay, I'm not sure if we have any data to demonstrate that in Quebec. In the US, there tends to be more boys than girls, but it's not a huge gap. And I don't know if you noticed, but the data that I presented to you is really dated. So it's from 2008. So just on a big scale, we need more quantitative data to have a better sense of what's going on right now. And we're still relying on that dated data, but it's the only data that we have, unfortunately.
If we want to influence schools, organizations, institutions, etc., in a transformative way, can you recommend some trainings or readings on race, trauma-informed action, etc.?
Yeah, I can't. I mean, I can. I've been doing this. We've been talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. We've been talking about inclusive education. We've been talking about trauma-informed practices. And I'm feeling that we're spinning our wheels, because if we constantly keep going towards action without even understanding how the problems are systemic and how it's just good. For example, I didn't talk a lot about the ableism that's happening in special education. So when we're talking about students who are in special schools, we're talking constantly about deficits. We're talking about disorders. We're talking about problems. We're talking, I mean, just for a student to carry that label with them for their entire trajectory, what is the effect of that? So we're going to be then moving on to differentiation and, accommodations, but we're not addressing like the root of the problem. So I think that we need to back up first and really take in how the ableism is just ingrained into everything, the policies, the practices, the way we refer to the kids, and the racism as well. And I don't think it's understood well enough for us to be talking about best practices yet.
Okay. Another from an anonymous person: how does the situation in Quebec compare to that in other provinces?
It's very similar. And again, there's not that much. In Ontario, they have a more defined portrait. So there is a report from 2017 by Carl James and Lana Turner. I believe her name's Lana or Tana Turner. And they really give a really broad view of what's happening in schools in Ontario in terms of special education overrepresentation, disciplinary disparities, the exclusion of families from the trajectories of their own children. And I would say that based on the little that we know, it aligns with what is happening in Ontario and in Nova Scotia specifically.
Sorry for the pace. There's just a lot of really great
Yeah,
questions, so
okay.
I'm sorry to keep on bombarding you, but we
Yeah,
have a great one from Nicholas here. Are you able to connect these experiences to outcomes later in life, most notably employment?
Okay, so again, there's extensive research done in the United States on this topic, and those links have been established there. So even when that portrait that I presented earlier about, problems like disparities with graduation rates, overrepresentation in the adult sector, employment, all of that the work has been done in the US. We're not there yet in terms of research in Quebec. There are some researchers who have looked at this in Ontario as well, but if I were to make a suggestion, I would definitely suggest that these experiences are connected, but the research doesn't exist yet to demonstrate that.
Okay, I just had a personal question. Well, coming from me, it's about the contracts. It's one thing that in your presentation, I was kind of like, wow, like I want to, know more about that. So can you elaborate just a little bit on these contracts that schools are asking children to sign, with possible expulsion being, a consequence of breaking the
Oh,
contract?
the behavioral contracts.
Right.
Okay, that was an interesting aspect too. So part of my research is that I wanted to consult the student files to understand again how they were placed in special schools, and it was very difficult to get access to the student files. So school boards were just not willing to share that information, and when they were willing, often the important documents were missing from the file. So it's difficult to ascertain what the contract is, but based on what the students said, the students were just saying, I was on a contract. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see what the contract actually entailed, but for the student, they were on the contract, and I guess they interpreted it the way they experienced it. And I'm happy that you brought the question up, because we can see that it's actually a mechanism towards expulsion. You know, it's kind of setting up a step towards expulsion, because chances are the contract is not going to be met.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that answer.
Yeah.
Well, with the little time we have left, I'll just ask a few more questions. But okay, this one is from another anonymous person. How much of your research do you think could be extended or is relevant to other racial minorities who experience similar types of barriers?
That's a really good question. I struggle with that question because what the research that exists right now is research that lumps everybody into one category. And if we actually look at that, at these types of research, we would get the impression that Black students are doing very well. We wouldn't be able to see the disparities that are happening. So when we are talking about groups of immigrants, we get a really general portrait. And then when we really kind of go in, even within the Black community, if we look at Haitian students versus African students, we're gonna have a really, really different portrait. So I do think that the methods that I used can be useful for many, many groups, but because of the gaps that exist in the research right now, I would promote really disaggregating things to get a really good perspective on a specific group at the moment.
I got a last personal question to ask, if that's okay. So just it's a question I have. I've been wondering, have you met with someone with a legal background with a specialization in children's rights, and have you heard anyone from that kind of background, legal background with focus on children's rights? Have you talked to them at all or gotten any sort of analysis or kind of any sort of opinion from them regarding some of your research, the implications of it, and you know how children are being impacted? Because for me, everything we've talked about is really within the realm of children's rights in Quebec and in Canada. So I'm just wondering.
Yes, thanks again for that question. So I haven't personally been in contact with anybody, but I do know that, again, I'm inspired by the work that's happening in Ontario. So in Ontario, they're moving in that direction, and we see that, you know, the things that are happening in schools are starting to be looked at from a legal perspective, but it's very in an infancy stage. So the conversations are just being had. In Quebec, I just think that we tend to get to the party late. So I haven't seen much of that. And again, just you're asking me this question, and what's coming to me is that I had to spend a lot of time just substantiating why it was important to do research on race. Whereas in other parts of the world, that question has already been answered. No one's really raising that question anymore. Like, it's an established in research already. And so here, I just had to go all the way back, and I feel like maybe if I didn't have to do that, I would have probably been at the stage that you're asking me if I'm at right now. So it's a lot of work and a lot of energy, because we really have to always start from the smallest block.
One more? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the answer, Tia. What are the long-term effects of this overrepresentation in special schools?
Okay, so again, I cannot speak to what the long-term effects are in Quebec, because the research on that hasn't been done yet. So if there are any researchers who are listening, we need research on that. But in the US, the connections are very clear. So in terms of employment, in terms of incarceration, they've really demonstrated how the school to prison pipeline exists, and this special education is a really important part of that trajectory. It often plays a role. So before you're going to prison, you were probably in a special school. So there are lots of very concerning situations that can be connected. We don't have the data here in Quebec. Even in Canada, we don't really have a lot of data. But if we base ourselves on what's happening in the US, it's going to be a really, really concerning situation.
Thank you very much, Tia. Thank you for those wonderful answers.
Thank you so much.
Okay, enormous thank you to Tia and John. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. You might have noticed that it's 10:15, so we're starting coffee break a bit later. But there is coffee in the welcome area. We'll aim to start in 15 minutes in the next sessions, but maybe in 20 minutes. But go get your coffee, and we look forward to joining the other sessions. Thank you again to John and Tia. Thanks, everyone.